Well, thank you for inviting me here today. I hope it's going to be a positive presentation, actually, as opposed to the title, which is very much geared towards when things go wrong. I'm, as Norman said, the disciplinary manager here at the institution. Been in this post now for coming up for 8 years, and things have changed a reasonably fair amount in those 8 years in terms of the nature of the complaints that are coming into the institution. But just to give a little bit of context first, the Istructe membership is about 28,000 members. I think Norman mentioned earlier today about the proportion of that membership who operate in either sole or small practitioner environments. Within that 28,000 membership, on average, we have about 30 cases a year which go through to the Professional Conduct Committee for their investigation and adjudication. Of those 30 cases a year, I would say upwards of 85% of those cases are, complaints or allegations made against those practicing in small or sole practitioner environments. Looking back at my own statistics, last year in 2016, 100% of the complaints that came through to the institution that went through to PCC level were against members in small or sole practitioner environments. Of those 30 cases a year, about 80% of them are in some part upheld, and of that 80%, about 85 to 90% of those are considered to be minor breaches of the Code of Conduct or other laws of the institution, and consequently 10 to 15% of the remaining ones are considered to be a major breach, and at that point they would be referred through to a full tribunal hearing with the disciplinary board. The other type of complaint that comes to the institution, which is invariably pointed towards small or sole practitioners, is about misrepresentation of institution titles. When we do investigate those, it is invariably a case of a misunderstanding or lack of understanding rather than any kind of calculated attempt to deceive the public. However, as an institution, we do have a duty of care both to the members of the public and also to our qualified members to ensure that those titles are used correctly, that the logo is used for business use correctly and by those who are suitably qualified to do so. Whilst there are only 30 complaints, roughly, a year that go through to the Professional Conduct Committee, we do receive a considerably higher number of initial inquiries with regard to the conduct or expectations of our members. And those inquiries come from both clients, so invariably members of the public, domestic clients, members of Istructe themselves, and also other professionals who may be involved in those projects. The types of initial inquiries that would come through from clients invariably are to do with contractual expectations. For example, is it okay for engineers to place limitations on their contractual obligations? And we've just heard about that before. Is it okay for engineers to place limitations on their contractual liabilities? And again, we've just heard from Kevin on that before as well. Other initial inquiries concern acceptable timescales. What's an acceptable time frame for the delivery of calculations, drawings, attending site, those sorts of things. And also expectations in terms of communications. Clients can't reach their engineers over the phone, over email. He or she has gone on holidays, currently in a period of illness, and they haven't informed the client. General expectation in terms of professionalism. Sometimes the conduct is perceived to be rude or threatening. Queries concerning the contractual obligations can, from the institution's perspective, from my office's perspective, be quite difficult to answer. And I'm very clear not to provide any advice which actually goes ahead and incriminates our members, because we don't have all of the facts at hand. But instead, we do provide general advice in terms of the expectation on our members and the obligations on our members in terms of the code of conduct and other laws of the institution. From our members, a lot of the inquiries from our members are proactive, which is very good to experience. Our members will generally seek advice before action in order to prevent a dispute, rather than follow. Although it does happen, we also get inquiries from our members after a complaint has been made against them. From our members, the types of inquiries that we have, again, are to do with contractual services. Am I allowed to place limitations on my obligations, on my scope, on my liability, those sorts of things. Increasingly, we see inquiries and advice requested in terms of what is the process for reviewing another engineer's work. And even more increasingly, we see initial inquiries, potential complaints coming about concerning employees who have breached an employment contract. Mostly it's to do with employers leaving one small practice, going to set up their own practice, or leaving and joining another small practice and taking with them clients, using information which promotes projects which have occurred at previous projects, using those to somehow embellish the work that they are doing in the new practice as well. And we are seeing quite a few more of those. And of course, we also get inquiries about what to do when a client threatens to withhold payment or indeed threatens to make a complaint. Clients do tend to use that as a negotiation tool, shall we say. In terms of the common allegations and findings that the PCC make, I thought it would be useful just to go through a few of those. The majority of the complaints to the PCC concern allegations of poor business practice and unprofessional conduct and poor judgment, rather than anything to do with the technical capability or engineering capability of the individual. Mostly, provision of services, failure to provide an adequate or clear brief, or in a lot of cases, a failure to provide any brief at all. And from an institution's perspective, we say that an adequate brief protects both parties. It needs not to be overly bureaucratic, but it should manage expectations. Ignoring the specific instructions of a client, and those instructions could include anything to do with budget, materials to be used, time frame, working alongside other contractors, etc. And also failing to meet agreed deadlines. In terms of communication, there are allegations with regards to failing to respond within a reasonable time, and reasonable in inverted commas, because what's reasonable to one person is completely unreasonable to another person, as I'm sure you're all aware. But going back to having in place a adequate and a clear brief, if those initial communications set out the provision of services, including the limitations of those services and the manageable timescales, they all go towards helping manage the client's expectations. Failing to notify clients of project changes when issues arise that require a change to a project, which happens an awful lot. Early agreement with the client, including any agreement to pay additional fees, is quite key. I'll go through a case study later which talks about just that, basically. And we also the PCC have made findings also that our members have been aggressive and threatening in their communications, and it's generally over a dispute with fees. Reviewing solutions, a failure to notify the original engineer, and criticising the work of another engineer without informing the engineer first. The Code of Conduct states that the original engineer should be invited, where possible, to respond to the checking and reviewing engineer's findings in order to ensure that both engineers have been provided with the same information and requirements. It's not unusual for a client to request the check of their original engineer's work and not provide the checking engineer with exactly the same information that was provided to the original engineer. Incompetence, as I say, most of the complaints that come to the institution are not to do with any form of technical competence, but operating outside an area of competence, in particular, taking on duties as a party wall surveyor, taking on duties as an expert witness, construction using specific materials. And we are seeing more, maybe it's because of the way domestic construction is going, but we're seeing more complaints occurring which are concerned with basement renovations, construction. So I thought it might be useful just to go through one or two case studies or scenarios, if you like, which are very typical in terms of leading to a complaint and allegations made against our members here. I'm sure you're all very familiar with a domestic renovation. The initial requirement being to provide calculations and drawings for a ground floor extension for building control approval, kind of bread and butter for a lot of our members. Mid-project, there is an amendment advised by the project architect, and that's to provide calculations and drawings for the removal of 2 internal walls, which the member duly does, provides the calculations and drawings. Critically, the engineer doesn't seek confirmation from the client before undertaking and delivering that work. Project stalls for a little while, and then when it resumes, the final requirement is to revert back to the ground floor extension only. Engineer submits his invoices, initial design work, amended design work, and the client disputes the fee for the additional work that's been undertaken. There's an impasse, and invariably the client then complains to the institution. In this scenario, it is very possible that an allegation concerning a failure to seek agreement from the client for additional works would result in a finding by the PCC that the member had breached the Code of Conduct. Second scenario is concerned with site investigations and reportings on that. The client uses the professional services website portal to instruct an engineer. There are a number of portals in existence which many of our members are associated with, and they link potential clients with our members and other professionals within the construction services. The client requests through the portal a full structural inspection and report. The engineer undertakes a structural inspection and provides a limited report. The client's unhappy with the extent of the report, normally because it doesn't tell them what they wanted to hear in the first instance, but that it doesn't meet the expectation of a full structural report. The client requests a refund, and then the client complains to the institution. In these scenarios, the problem occurs when the front-end marketing and the advertising of those services is a mismatch to that which is being offered by the engineer. And it's, from the institution's perspective, it's the responsibility of our members to ensure that their clients, however they have been introduced to that client, whether it's through another construction professional or through one of these portals, the responsibility is on the member to ensure that the client is fully aware of what it is that they'll be getting, for what cost, and what the limitations are in terms of that service. Good practice, and expected practice to a large extent, is that in a situation such as this, the intended scope and purpose of the report should be incorporated in a letter of acceptance before carrying out the appointment, and then that should be repeated again in the report itself. Our members are expected to advise the client and ensure that the client understands any limitations of the service and obtain written acceptance of that before commencing any work. And in the absence of any clarification of those services and a written agreement before the contract commences, and if a complaint does come through to the institution, it's very likely that the PCC will uphold that complaint. In terms of appropriate professional communications, again, very typical scenario. Engineers contracted to provide calculations and drawings for the removal of an internal supporting wall. The engineer provides a hand-drawn sketch and calculations based on that assumption, and the client orders the steel, then goes about opening up on site, and the contractor advises that the wall's not supported. Client requests a refund for unnecessary calculations, compensation for the cost of the redundant steel, also claims that the hand-drawn sketches are unprofessional and calculations illegible, even though they were perfectly good quality in order to be able to order the redundant steel in the first instance. They kind of like to throw these things in. And then client complains to the institution. It's a very common complaint. And what we see is that whether the members found to be in breach of the code is often determined by whether the members describe the limitations or the assumptions that they're going to make in carrying out that contract. It's normal and advisable, obviously from our perspective, that a member would advise the client that those assumptions should be confirmed on site before proceeding to order construction materials, and also if the initial fee doesn't include amendments to a design based on assumptions, then it should say that, and there should be an agreement from the client that those assumptions are taken into consideration. And if further work is required, then it's reasonable that an additional fee is to be charged. In terms of a communication, again, not an untypical scenario. Client complains that there's been unreasonable delays to their project. Engineer provides a very valid explanation, but the client doesn't accept that and it requires an immediate solution. There is no immediate solution, but the client telephones, emails daily, sometimes twice daily, sometimes 3 times daily, sometimes more. The member ignores those persistent emails and phone calls because, quite frankly, there's quite a lot of other work to be done, and you've given one answer. The answer isn't going to change. Client threatens to withhold payment, member threatens to withhold service, an impasse occurs and the project incurs further delay. The member then initiates legal process to recover the fees and the client complains to the institution. Ignoring emails and telephone calls is rarely acceptable. Although can be understandable, it's not always acceptable, and it invariably increases frustration and dissatisfaction. As a member of the institution, our members are expected to discharge their duties with courtesy and remain professional at all times, even in adverse circumstances, where the conduct of a client may be quite trying, shall we say. Failing to communicate or ignoring or avoiding a client's communications is likely to result in a finding of a breach of the Code of Conduct. In addition, withholding service until payment is made may be, not always, but can be construed as threatening and may also result in a finding against the member. These scenarios, these past 4 scenarios that I've talked about, represent very common situations and practices which on a good day would not present any issue or dispute at all. However, as with many common practices, there isn't a problem until there's a problem. And invariably, these types of complaints, the ones that I've just talked about, they're dealt with by the Professional Conduct Committee, who either dismiss the complaint or aspects of it, or issue a lower level non-punitive sanction. In the case of more serious complaints, it is rare for the Professional Conduct Committee to make a finding of a serious lack of integrity or probity. And when this occurs, it is invariably a matter for the full hearing at the disciplinary board. Types of serious complaints could be serious misrepresentation, exorbitant or unjustified fees, non-provision of service, plagiarism, aggressive or threatening behaviour, a lack of probity and or honesty, and also a failure to engage with the disciplinary process itself. We've sent or had no option but to refer 3 complaints this year from Professional Conduct Committee up to the disciplinary board for a full hearing, simply because of a member's failure to engage with the disciplinary process. It will only ever exacerbate matters. So whilst that's all very negative, apologies, it is important to say that whilst the majority of complaints that are made to the institution do concern members such as yourselves, working in small practices or as sole practitioners, it's not in any way a reflection of the engineering capability or technical competence of small sole practitioners, nor the exemplary business practice of the vast majority of most of our members. You'll see from the case studies that the complaints arise typically out of poor or naive business practice and or poor judgment, and are absolutely more often than not a one-off blip. These are not repeat offences. And we try to our Professional Conduct Committee is made up of 15 senior members of the institution. And every single one of them, they're from a range of different backgrounds, but there are a significant number of them who are from the sole and small practitioner environment. And every single one of them, when a complaint comes through, thinks there but for the grace of God, because that could be any one of them sat there. And they also offer some insight to the vulnerability of They also offer some insight into the potential vulnerability of small and sole practitioners, whereby there are some administrative processes which may seem like an overburden on a small or sole practitioner, in particular a lack of a complaint process. In periods of unplanned leave, whether it's to do with illness or for other reasons, there's no opportunity to delegate that work through to somebody else. There's a perceived lack of support. Cash flow can often be a problem, which is why there can be a tendency to throw out threatening letters in terms of engaging legal representatives to obtain unpaid fees, and also a perceived lack of access to early advice. In terms of the support from us here at the institution, there's a significant amount of written guidance. We've produced a number of guidance articles relevant to small practitioners and indeed to all of our members. The Code of Conduct and the guidance notes is intended to be a positive document rather than punitive, and whilst not exhaustive, does offer guidance on a number of different scenarios. The Business Practice and Regulatory Affairs Committee has produced a number of business practice notes on a number of issues, quite a number of issues actually, but they do include those on some guidance on contracts and fees. Structural Engineer Journals produced guidance articles on matters relating to the Party Wall Act, acting as an expert witness, as well as articles concerning professional indemnity insurance and liability. I'm always available to take either telephone or email advice, either in advance of a dispute being made or, unfortunately, also after a complaint has been made. We don't have yet an alternative dispute resolution service here at the institution, and we are looking at the possibility of setting one up. The complaint process doesn't seek to resolve disputes. We don't award compensation, we don't fine, we can't require members to provide services. So there is to a large number of complainants, there's no resolution to their complaint other than the member gets sanctioned. So we are looking at what we can provide better by way of alternative dispute in order to avoid the complaint process in its entirety. And I'd very much welcome your thoughts, not just on the ADR service, but anything else that's to do with the code of conduct, the disciplinary process. Obviously, the vast majority of you sat here don't know me, won't ever know me. That's a really, really good thing. But I'm always available for telephone advice, email advice, should you need to know anything with regards to conduct. Thank you.